We've come to the end of the first masterclass, and after each masterclass we're going to have a short discussion where one of us takes the role of interrogator and starts asking a few questions. So Simon, you've been teaching Haskell and Erlang for several years now. What do you see the advantages and disadvantages of the different languages, and how do you see the things you learnt in Haskell going over to Erlang and vice versa?
Well, that's a good question. I think our students find Erlang more approachable. I think the fact it's a small language, relatively, fewer syntactic constructs, fewer things. Well, types initially not being there or being very weakly typed is a very good thing, I think. I think later on, the major disadvantage of teaching Erlang is the lack of a strong type system. So doing type-driven design is more difficult. You know, saying here's the type of the functions we want to define, let's define the functions against that. It's harder to make that stick in Erlang. Yeah. But I think that would be the one big disadvantage.
But you've also been teaching Erlang, but you don't come from this strongly typed background. How long does it take people to become proficient in Erlang? It
depends, but rule of thumb, it will depend very much from programmer to programmer. But yeah, having taught people out in the industry, someone who's worked with a particular technology for about a decade, it will take him about 6 months to become completely productive. And the 6 months, it's not a learning curve, it's more of an unlearning curve. So unlearning the object-oriented way of doing things.
Well, but that's true of our students as well. Because our students have just learned objects. Yes. All they know is Java.
So would it be better if they hadn't learned this at all?
No, I think my feeling is if they've learnt one language well, one paradigm well, then learning another is not a problem. I'm not of the school where I think there's only one true way. I think OO is good in some circumstances, right. Erlang in functional programming is good in others. And I think the students gain from learning two different paradigms. Right. So even if they're going to be Java programmers, never write any Erlang, the fact they know there are different ways of doing it is to their value. And the good students see that. They understand immutability, they understand
So what's the thing they find most difficult?
Recursion is difficult to start with. Understanding that recursion is the motive power of the language. There are no constructs like while loops and so on. The fact that there aren't side effects can be a problem, because I think they've learned OO and they understand that objects do things, and things are done to objects and their state changes. So moving to a world where you're thinking about values and calculation and messages passing between processes, that's a different model for them.
And do you find that people find recursion difficult, or?
Well, when people learn Erlang, I tend to find there are 3 hurdles in learning it. And the first hurdle is pattern matching. It's actually optimally using pattern matching. The first set of exercises, and we'll use if statements and case statements, and you sit down with them, you review the code, and you rewrite everything, getting rid of them, and start pattern matching in the function heads. The second hurdle is understanding recursion, and the whole concept of tail recursion versus non-tail recursion, which in Erlang is very important. And the third kind of hurdle is thinking concurrently. Making sure that you design your system having a process for every.
Because it surprises me that both of you said recursion and pattern matching, because I would think that the concurrency bit is the difficult. Well, not using processes.
I mean, it's partly we're talking about the functional bit of the language here, and that's what I'm teaching right at the moment to our students. So I guess I'm thinking about that. But I think the model of concurrency, the message passing model, is a very clear one.
And both of you, what do you think the best way to learn Erlang is?
Practice. Practice.
So you need a problem you need to solve.
You don't learn to swim by reading a book about swimming and swimming a lane, but you wouldn't do it very well, right? No. So I think, and I say this to my students, you're not going to. Things aren't necessarily easy, but things become easier the more you do them. So understanding, trying things out. I think one funny thing our students sometimes do, they write a program and they think, okay, I've done that, but they don't compile it, they don't test it necessarily. So I think making sure that they do that, they engage with it, they use test data and so on. They might use property based testing. We're thinking of doing that this year with our students.
And do they like it? I mean, here they are, they've been doing Java, and now there's this funny thing that
I think what's a real selling point for Erlang is the fact that it is used in anger for doing real programming. I think that makes a big difference. We know that Haskell is increasingly being used, say, in the financial industry, but I think the fact that Erlang is used in something like WhatsApp.
Yes.
And the history of
So
Erlang
did that, when the
in Erlang.
WhatsApp came out, did that cause a stir?
Oh yeah,
students
certainly.
could go in and
Yes.
say, hey, look, it's really being used. Yeah,
And also we've had a history over the years. Francesco has been coming for perhaps 12 years or so to talk to our functional programming students. Sometimes when we were teaching them Haskell, recently Francesco has not come, but somebody from Erlang Solutions, Torben Hoffman, has come and has given a very inspiring talk to the students. And he's very good at saying how Erlang is different.
One question I got once is, why we're learning Haskell and you've given us a lecture over how Erlang is being used in the real world. Why are they actually teaching us Haskell and not Erlang? Right. And the natural answer there was, you're here to learn how to learn.
Yes.
And
because I've seen it in the conferences, from functional programming being a single session in one track to entire conferences devoted to it. So it's not quite mainstream yet, but it's definitely impinging upon people's consciences.
No. But I think I don't have strong feelings. I enjoy teaching Haskell, I enjoy teaching Erlang. Yes. I think next year we're going to teach our students a compiling techniques course using OCaml. Yes. And that's fine, because the approach is, there's so much more in common than there is, and I think it's a great shame if people become doctrinaire and say it's like Stalinists and Trotskyists. They see bigger differences between...
I see it as
I wasn't suggesting you were, Joe.
I'm thinking that once you've learnt Ruby or something like that, or Python, it's a way of thinking.
Yeah,
and one maps fairly naturally onto the other. So once you've learnt Haskell, up to monads and things like that, it looks very much like Erlang. You just move the brackets around a bit.
Yes.
You take the brackets out, actually, and you remove the commas.
And that can be
syntactic noise.
And but students find the Haskell syntax much more difficult than the Erlang syntax.
Right. Yeah, well, I always did.
Yeah.
I couldn't see how many... I think of things as being defined as 3 arguments, and it gets called with 2 arguments.
Yeah, indeed.
Where's the extra argument gone?
Yeah, no, indeed.
So currying and things like that, I never really
And so our students do find that tricky. And so the Erlang being rather more concrete and sometimes a bit noisier syntactically isn't a problem for them.
No.
I found Haskell and Erlang, at least we taught in universities, very complementary of each other as well. And my opinion is that any student taking a computer science degree should learn both. Have
you ever done that? People have started with Haskell, have then learnt Erlang, or the other way around, and did that? Did they learn it quicker?
It would be really interesting to do some experimentation, but the trouble is, it's so difficult to get rid of all the confounding. I don't think you can get defensible data in that area. But certainly anecdotally, I think our students, partly because in teaching Erlang, you're teaching both new ideas in functional programming and new ideas in concurrency. And we're saying it's a means to an end to understand all these different paradigms, and and there are applications out there at the end. I think that fits better.
So you talked a lot about the things that were good in Erlang and the kind of problems that it was good at, but you didn't say anything about problems it was bad at. So what kind of problems would Erlang be totally inappropriate for solving, and what would you do about that?
One thing I mentioned was the type-driven development thing.
Yes.
It would be nice if Erlang's, for example, Dialyzer were better integrated with Erlang, because I think it would be nice to be able to say, we're defining a function that takes expressions to Booleans, and you could check.
And what about integration with other languages, and where they're completely untyped? I'm not talking about Haskell. I'm talking about connecting it to Python or to C or something like that. Is that a problem?
That's what we do all the time. I mean, we use Erlang as the glue to handle the whole orchestration, and then we use Python, C, Julia. No, not at all. It is actually a language intended, to act as a hub, towards other languages. And interfaces could be protocols. They could be RESTful APIs or other programming languages. It's ideal for that.
And I think being able to say, look at the big Erlang applications. They run C and Erlang, and they work. They work very well together. So I think. But it's one of those things, again, if we're teaching this to second-year students, they're not at a stage where perhaps they understand software architecture in any sort of substantial way. So understanding that systems might have C at the bottom and Erlang in the middle,
because I'm just wondering,
that's something new for them.
Yeah, but I mean, things like that are common to all functional languages, this idea of immutable data and things like that. Is that? I mean, I see it in things like Git.
Yes,
the fact that Git works because with immutable data you can cache things and you can reason about them. Do they see the benefits of it? I see the benefits of it. Do they see the benefits of it?
I think, for our students, perhaps it's a bit early for that.
Right.
We can show them that they can write very direct, they can write nice recursive nice recursive descriptions of transformations over trees or whatever. I mean, the stuff I've been doing in this masterclass, that those are very direct.
Because it's funny, when I teach
data.
it, the students start asking, they say, where's the debugger? And I said, well, there isn't a debugger. Or there is a debugger, but no Erlang programmers use it. And they say, well, why is that? And I said, well, because you don't have variables that are changing under your feet, that it's difficult to reason about it. You know, once they've got a value, they've got the value forever.
Yes,
and they acquire it in one place, and therefore you don't need to track it.
The only problem, and I've been talking to students about that this week, they say, well, you've got these variables in functions, those change. So you've got to say, each instance of a variable is immutable. So there are subtleties there. I would
just add where not to use Erlang. I think two very distinct cases are, for example, number crunching, and graphical interfaces. The libraries are appalling, and I think they're much better.
So if you had to choose one strong point for Erlang, what would you say was its unique strong point, or one or two? What would you say about that?
Massive concurrency, orchestration. The fact that your systems behave in a predictable way under extreme heavy load, heavy load under extended period, or under extremely high peak load as well, you won't get any degradation of throughput in your system.